I'm seeing students growing up today that have never used a ruler to measure anything. They've never used a tool. Well, how is a student going to find out they like tools if they're not exposed to tools? See, most of the people that I've worked with, they may have had a single welding class in high school, or they grew up working on cars.
Hello, everyone. This is Gretchen Rowe, and it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Temple Grandin to the Demme Learning Show today. We've been looking forward to this conversation for months, and I am delighted to spend the next hour with her talking about her book entitled Visual Thinking and all the things that she has to share with us today. And Dr. Grandin, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself if you would be so kind.
Hi, I'm Temple Grandin. I am a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. I was also a very severely autistic child with no speech until age 4. I was very lucky to get into very good early educational intervention by 2.5. My mother always helped develop my art ability. I think it's very important with autistic kids is take the thing they're good at and build on it. I've been hearing some stories that I do not like about little autistic kids in elementary school that are super good at math, and they're making them do the same baby math, and they're getting bored and becoming behavior problems. If you got a fourth grader that's good at math, let's give him the more advanced math. Just let him do it in his third grade desk. They give you all kinds of reasons why they won't do that.
Well, your journey has been such a remarkable one, and I have followed it closely for a number of years. I have so many questions to ask, but let's start with visual thinking. This is your latest work. This is a New York Times bestseller. Can you tell us what the genesis was for this? And I know what you're going to say, but for our audience, if you would share how you came to feel that this message was really important.
Well, I'm noticing that there's areas where we're losing skills. Let's take food processing equipment, for example, especially for poultry and for pork. Most of that equipment now comes out of Europe. And one of the reasons for that is the people that I worked with on equipment, they've retired out. I worked with people on beef equipment that were definitely autistic, that had their own shops. And these people are retired out. They can't find anybody to fix anything. And it's getting worse. As I travel around the country, I'm finding broken elevators everywhere where I go. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And visual thinkers like me, who are terrible at math, would love fixing elevators because they are mechanical devices. So in my book, I discuss the different kinds of thinkers. You have the object visualizer like me, who's horrible at higher math, but understands mechanical devices, animals, good at art and photography. Then another kind of mind, and there's research to support this, which I discuss in my visual thinking book, is the pattern mathematical thinker, the visual spatial mathematical thinker who thinks in patterns, think music and math. These are your math kids, and that's a different kind of thinking. And then you have a autistic word thinker. They love history, they love facts, and they think in words. And they can have complementary skills. Let's go back to a food processing plant. My kind of mind invents all the mechanical equipment and builds it. They don't just build the equipment, they invent it and patent it. And then your degreed engineer, university engineer, is needed for refrigeration, boilers, or keep the roof from falling in, for the more things that require the mathematics. You see, you need to have both kinds of minds to build a good food processing plant. You see, that's an example of complementary skills. And I do a lot of talks for businesses. And I said the first step is you have to realize that these different kinds of thinking exist. I didn't know that word thinking existed until I was in my late 30s. I thought everybody thought in pictures the way I do, but they don't. And then, of course, a lot of people are mixtures of the different kinds of thinking. And in my visual thinking book, I have a bunch of research studies that show that the picture thinker like me and the mathematical thinker are different kinds of minds. And there's some brand new research that was just published in Nature in 2024, so it's not in the book, that words are not required for thought, basically. That mathematical thought and visual thinking do not require words. There is thinking without words, and that is brand new information 2024.
Wonderful. That's terrific. You know, one of the things that compelled me so much with this book is it answered so many questions about myself. You have a survey in here that's a very simple answer to the question, do I think visually? And I was remarkably surprised to find how thoroughly I think visually. And I think it helped me understand why sometimes people don't understand. Those of us who think visually don't always translate well what we're
That's
trying
right.
to explain. We can see it, but we don't understand that you can't see it.
Well, the verbal thinker tends to overgeneralize. This is one of the things tends to happen. And I've been reading some kind of alarming research on things like ChatGPT, that if these AI programs keep reading their own stuff, they tend to over summarize, overgeneralize, and leave out information that may be important that's not mentioned as many times.
Interesting. Interesting. Tell me a little bit about your process. You provide so much information. I have a variety of books here. I just finished reading Animals in Translation this morning over my breakfast coffee. You do so much research. How do you find the time to do all that research? Is it just what interests you, or do you run yourself down a rabbit hole because you're looking for an answer to a question?
Well, of course, I did visual thinking during COVID, so I had plenty of time to research because that Betsy Lerner and I, that was our big COVID project. Now, just an example of different minds working together. My thinking is associational, so it's not that well organized. And then I do the rough drafts, and then Betsy would smooth them all out for me. But Betsy would have never found some of the scientific stuff that I found. No, I'm a very good internet surfer on things like Google Scholar, and I use different keywords to find things. I remind my students because I have a class in livestock handling, I'm going to be doing the first class today, that you, cattle have 6 different words: bull, cow, heifer, steers, calves, and calves. So let's say I want to find an article about how to feed cattle, and I just talk about feeding corn to cattle, for example. If I don't do another search, feeding corn to steers, I won't find a paper where they only use the word steers rather than cattle. And you don't mix all the stuff together. Then I might do corn feeding for bulls. So that's going to be 3 separate little searches to find all the papers. Because
Interesting.
in Europe, they feed a lot of bulls. So you could have a paper where you could have a situation where you might have an important paper where they just use bulls and the word cattle's not in it.
Interesting.
That
Interesting.
stuff I've figured out about surfing.
Which is valuable for all of us who are educating our children or teaching children. Tell me a little bit about the premise that you put forth that I thought was so compelling in this book about the fact that we are teaching to only one kind of learner.
Well, that's the problem. The verbal thinkers are kind of taken over. Uh, there's a tendency to think the visual thinkers who can't do algebra are stupid. But I've worked with these people, and they don't just build equipment, they invent equipment. I've gone through their patents. They don't do frivolous patents. They patent stuff that the industry still uses, 20 some years later. It's a different kind of thought. And one of the reasons why the Europeans are supplying a lot of this specialized equipment is because in ninth grade, a child can decide, do I go tech route or do I go university route? And they don't tend to stick their nose up at the tech route. And a lot of the people I worked with, some of them were autistic, had their own businesses, their own independent businesses. And they start out really small and they do a small project. And then the customer would like them. Then they do a more complicated project. And then 15 years later, they're in charge of the new cooler addition on a plant. I've seen people do that.
And in your field, you said one of the things that you said in the book was we're outsourcing so much of this that we're losing the ability to develop those kinds of thinkers here. What would you say to people in the Department of Education? What do we need to change to make us more competitive that way?
Well, we need to put all the hands-on classes back in. And I couldn't believe it. Somebody asked me the other day, what are hands-on classes? Shop, welding, wood shop, cooking, sewing, all of the hands-on classes, and I put those all back in because I'm seeing students growing up today that have never used a ruler to measure anything. They've never used a tool. Well, how is a student going to find out they like tools if they're not exposed to tools? See, most of the people that I worked with, they may have had a single welding class in high school, or they grew up working on cars. And I'll tell you how to get the video addicts off the video games: automobile mechanics. There's been 5 or 6 successes with young adults getting them off of video games with car mechanics. And they find out that motors are a lot more interesting than video games. You see, those are your visual thinkers that can just see how a machine works. I had a chance to visit a newspaper that still had an old linotype machine, a really complicated machine that was used for setting type years ago. And they were telling me about years ago when someone bought this old linotype machine. There it is right there. Old linotype machine that usually you have to have a 2-week course where someone comes in to show you how to use it. This guy was such a mechanical genius, he figured out how to use it himself.
Wow,
He
that's
just
amazing.
saw how it worked. You see, it's a totally mechanical device. It melts lead to make the type. And the keyboard is not the QWERTY keyboard. It's a really awful keyboard I couldn't possibly type on. But you see, the person who's the mechanical mind just sees how something works. In other words, you see a solution to a problem. The mathematician calculates. Let's go back to the Fukushima nuclear power plant. This is why we need to have visual thinkers. And I couldn't believe it when I found out why Fukushima burned up. And they had failed to put waterproof doors on to protect the electric emergency cooling pump that was in the basement from being flooded. Now, the engineers, the mathematicians, they did a wonderful time making it earthquake proof. It shook and it shook and it shook. Everything was fine. 20 minutes later, the tsunami breached the seawall. It only took me 20 minutes on Google to very quickly find easy to find data that would show that the seawall is going to get breached. It's like they didn't see it. They just didn't see it. You see, this is why you need both kinds of problem solving, because that was a gigantic visual thinking mistake that I just couldn't believe that they made it. Watertight doors would have saved it. It would not have happened if they'd had waterproof doors.
Interesting. I found that argument that you made so compelling in the book because sometimes when we create teams of people, it's easy to find people who all think the same way. And you said we should have each kind of thinker on any team to make it successful.
Well, we have to recognize the different things they're good at and that the skills can be complementary. And I'm very, very concerned that my kind of thinker, the visual thinker, is getting screened out because we can't do higher math. And some people think that you need to have algebra in order to think. No, you don't. No, I just see solutions. Let me just think of give you a real simple example. Okay, there's the big Microsoft computer crash, and of course strollers and everything were getting lost at the airport. And one lady was really upset because the airlines lost her stroller, and she had kids that were old enough to sit up, and I immediately saw them in a blue Denver airport wheelchair. Okay, to replace the stroller. Infants, no, they'd fall out. But I just saw it. It just came up in my mind as a picture. That's just a very simple example of a visual solution to a problem.
Absolutely. That makes sense. That makes sense. You had also said that in one of the courses that we're missing in school is drafting. And you had said that that would be something that would be a course of study that a lot of students who maybe don't have the algebraic thinking would be able to be very successful with. Can you talk a little bit about why?
Well, you have to visualize the building. The first step in learning drafting is you have to recognize what the lines on the drawing mean in relation to the structure. Like, for example, if there's squares on the drawing, those may be columns that hold up the roof. And one of the things that helped me read drawings was what I kind of made my own internship at the Swift plant in Tolleson, Arizona, They lent me a beautiful set of hand-done drawings of the plant. And I walked around in there for 2 days until every line on that drawing related to a structure in the plant. And it was a very, very accurate drawing. A lot of the drawings we're getting today are terrible. These computer-aided drawings, they're not very good drawings. They're leaving rebar placement out, reinforcement rod placement out, things like that. They're leaving out important detail that you need for building something correctly. And in my livestock handling class, the students have to make a scale drawing, and they're having more and more problems with doing the scale drawing because I have students that have never used a ruler.
Wow.
Never have measured anything. And then they might ask, well, why would I ever need to make a scale drawing? Okay, can understand maybe they don't ever need to make a cattle handling facility. Let's say they're remodeling their house, or they want to make sure their furniture is going to fit in the living room before they buy it. That would be a good use of a scale drawing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you give us some examples of occupations where a pattern or mathematical thinker would excel?
Oh, they're going to excel in chemistry, computer programming. That's a big area where mathematical thinkers excel. Figuring out power requirements, balancing the power grid. You need people like me to make sure that the wires don't fall off the towers like they do in California, but they never maintain them. And the mathematicians balance the power grid. Let's look at when Texas had that big freeze. They talked about that in a very abstract way. You have power plants where stuff froze in them and it didn't work. And my first step in how to deal with this would be to figure out what piece of equipment actually froze in each station, and then figure out how difficult it would be to winterize, and then rank them in order. And I'd have to go visit the maintenance department. They'd show me. You let me loose in there for 3 hours, I'm going to go right down to the shop, and I'll find out what froze. And some are going to be very difficult to fix, and others can maybe fixed easily. But how can you even discuss it rationally without listing what froze in each plant? Okay, let's say I can get half the stations back on. All right, then I'm going to go to the mathematicians. Okay, can I at least do decent rolling blackouts on a schedule? That's better than no power. That has to be, figured out by the mathematicians.
Right.
But I'm the one who's going to say, okay, now what froze? Why did the coal-fired plant not work? We have a coal-fired plant. It's never frozen.
You also had said that when we talked in preparation for this, that you wanted to talk about how it would be important for parents and teachers to look for those visual thinkers. So what are the things I should be looking for in my students or my children to know that they have that visual talent?
Well, it tends to show up, around 6 or 7 in building things. These are the kids that might be super, super good at Legos. And then the mistake that's made is they're not graduating to tools. I was using tools in 2nd grade, using them really carefully, but I was using them. They're simply not using tools. And then how can you know you're good at tools if you're not exposed to them? Your math kids, the way you'll tell is they're getting frustrated doing the baby math. You need to move them ahead in math. You just start seeing what do they tend to be good at. And a lot of math kids are also good at music. I was exposed to musical instruments. I had a little flute. I couldn't figure out how to play that little flute, but I was exposed to it. You see, if you don't expose kids to a lot of stuff, how do you know what they're going to be good at? You're just not going to know.
Well, your mom was remarkable in the fact that she was such an advocate for you in a time where advocacy for children was not something that was innate to the culture. One of the things that I found so remarkable is that your mom insisted that you learn things like social modicums and social graces. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that makes a huge difference. And I think a lot of us are missing that in this day and age, even for kids who don't have autism.
Well, it was standard 50s parenting. I remember this. I'm a child of the 50s. To teach kids to say thank you, teach kids to shake hands, say please. Well, they would cue me, you've got to say please. And then if I didn't do it at the neighbor's house, grown-ups corrected kids. This was old-fashioned 50s parenting. And I think this is one of the reasons why I've talked to a number of grandparents who discover they're autistic later on in life, where that helps them with their relationships. But they were taught social skills. These very, very basic social skills are not being taught. And she also had a very good sense of how much to stretch me. You don't take an autistic kid and force them into rapid multitasking at the McDonald's takeout window. That's just too much rapid multitasking. That's not going to work. The other big place we're really falling down is making the transition to work. We're doing really badly on that because working skills are not the same as academic skills. I'm seeing students graduate magna cum laude from college, but they don't handle work very well because they never learned working skills, and they need to start learning young how to work for somebody that's outside the family. That's the boss. So they need to learn.
Now, why would you say someone outside the family?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of parents that overprotect too much. They've got to learn how to do things outside the family. And those grandparents that had great jobs, they had paper routes when they were young. So we need to replace that with things like volunteer jobs at a farmer's market, maybe at a church, doing volunteer work where somebody else is the boss. They need to start getting jobs before they graduate from high school. And I see a lot of parents overprotect. I think they get too locked into the autism, well, they can't do anything. And there was a certain people about me that thought I was stupid and wouldn't be able to do anything.
I have a question for you from Connie. She says, my son has intellectual disabilities and a low IQ, in addition to his APD and being on the spectrum. He has a vivid imagination, but struggles with all other areas. How do I discover what he's good at? And I think that question can be generalized. There's a lot of parents who are saying, how do I discover what my child is good at?
Well, they have to be exposed to lots of different things. How would you know a kid's good at music if they're not exposed to musical instruments? Um, Drawing and art was one of my things. I loved art class when I was in elementary school. Well, I was a good in art class. Was a kid good at mathematics? Try different mathematics. We also need to get kids interested in things like some of these mathematics kids, when they get bored, get into piles of trouble. Well, let's talk to them about interesting things they could do with that math when they grow up. How about making a solar panel that will last 50 years instead of 25 years? How about better batteries so that an electric car can go twice as far on a charge and not have any risk of having a fire? That's stuff that I can show to third and fourth graders of really constructive stuff they could do when they grow up. And that's kind of heavy duty physics stuff that's going to be for the math kids.
Right. Right, absolutely. And as a parent, what you're saying is then we need to think in possibilities of the things we should expose our children to. Your life was quite a remarkable one in the fact that you were exposed to so many things as a young child that a lot of people culturally would have thought you weren't able to do.
No, that's right. And we go out with the other kids. We're building tree houses. We're just doing, all kinds of things. And kids don't tinker anymore. Like I can remember as a young kid, we set up an old army tent to have a sleep out in, and we set it up wrong. Did the grown-ups get involved in that? No. As long as we didn't do anything dangerous, the grown-ups just let us set it up wrong. Tinker, figure out how to do things.
So I love what you're saying about figure out how to do things, but it seems like as a society, we have lost the ability to persevere. How, as a parent, can we cultivate that perseverance in our kids?
Encourage them to try different things. I think part of this comes from not doing hands-on things. Because if you don't do some tinkering with hands-on things, you're just not going to do it. When I was 7, I would tinker for hours to get a little bird kite to work. In fact, I have a book called Calling All Minds that is my little project book for kids. So I've got all kinds of kites in it, parachutes, things that I made as a kid. And I tinkered for hours with this thing. Also have another book, The Outdoor Scientist. Again, that's kids' projects. We've got to get kids off of devices. I'm not suggesting banning it. Let's limit it to an hour a day and get them out doing more real things. Then they're going to get interested in it. And so I have a math kid. I'm going to move my head in math. Maybe he can do college math in the fourth grade classroom. Let him do it on computer. All right, what can you do with that math? That's where I take him out and I show him a big field of solar panels. Say, I have to tear these all out 25 years from now. That's going to be a real mess. Okay, your chemistry, that's math. Make a panel that's going to last longer. That's the kind of stuff I can just present to a young, I'm not a kindergarten kid, but I'm elementary school kid, and that's something that they could do when they grew up. Because these kids tend to get obsessed, and I'd like to have them get obsessed with something constructive, like making a better battery, for example, or figuring out how to make smaller computer memory. So I always like to tell kids where the movies live online. Giant data centers, show them pictures of that, big warehouses full of computers that eat horrible amounts of electricity. Figure out how to make that smaller and have less energy. Like give them those kind of challenges. I'd rather have them grow up, and I want to have them grow up and do those kinds of things, and not go down rabbit holes I really don't want them to go down.
What are your closing thoughts for us today?
Well, I want to see the kids that think differently really do great things. Steve Jobs was probably on the spectrum. Bill Gates is probably on the spectrum. Einstein was on the spectrum. There are a lot of really talented people that are on the spectrum, and we need their minds to solve problems in the future. And we got to show kids lots of interesting stuff to get them interested.
Absolutely.
That's one of the things we got to do.
Absolutely.
And then take something that's fixated and broaden it so it's not so fixated.
Absolutely. I think you have inspired us all today. I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. I appreciate it more than you will ever know. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demme Learning Show. Thanks so much for joining us. You can access the show notes or watch a recording at demmelearning.com/show or on our YouTube channel. Be sure to review, rate, or subscribe wherever you may be hearing this, especially if you really enjoyed it. Dr. Grandin, thank you so much for your time. It has been my great pleasure to host you today.